Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here this afternoon with us. The talk is called Teprotumumab and Beyond. I think I'm very, very happy to be working with Dr. Kahana on this clinical study. I think it's very inspiring, and it's an amazing time to see what's coming in the future for thyroid diabetes. I have no financial disclosures. So foremost, when we talk about clinical research, the question becomes, what is clinical research? Why is this important? Right? So clinical research, these are voluntary studies that patients participate in to study a new medication, new intervention, and to make sure that it's safe and efficacious. And the reason why it's important is because the U.S. federal law says that for a new medication to be commercially available to the public, we have to show that it's safe, and we have to show that it works. Right? The NIH, the National Institute of Health, and the FDA have very strict and vigorous guidelines for how these studies are conducted. And they can be sponsored by different organizations, biotech, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, federal agencies, or even investigative physician-initiated. And then they're conducted at a wide variety of settings as well. So they can be conducted at a university, a hospital, or even at KOS in our Livonia office. We're a clinic. Now here, I just want to briefly walk through a timeline of what clinical research looks like, and starting on the left, right? The goal is really to get a medication, a product, available for patients in the end. So before any medication can be given to a patient, there's lots of years of clinical research studies behind it, right? We call this preclinical or basic science research. And there are scientists who dedicate their lives looking at thyroid eye disease, the molecular cascade, which targets are we going to intervene in. And the best way to kind of represent what this looks like is a lock and key mechanism. There's a lock or a target that we want to intervene in, and there's thousands of compounds or keys that get tried out to see which lock and key mechanism fit best. And ultimately, these get tested in different cell lines, in tissues that mimic orbital tissues in animal models, and eventually this all gets wrapped up in a big application. It's like the biggest science report you've ever seen in your life, hundreds of pages long, and gets submitted to the FDA. And when they give the go ahead and say, yes, we like what you see this is promising, then we can start clinical research before it can be given to that patient. Right? So the phases of clinical trials, you may have heard phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. What does it really mean? So in phase 1 clinical trials, these are studies that are conducted in healthy volunteers. It's usually a small group. And the goal is to look at how safe is this medication when given to patients. And that's foremost the priority. If everything checks out then we can move to a phase 2 study, where now it's given to patients with a disease condition. So now given to thyroid eye disease patients. And here, we're looking at how well does the medication work in treating TED, right? The primary outcomes that really get looked at for the clinical studies that are coming out are reduction in proptosis. How much of that bulging of the eyes does it help with? What does the clinical activity score of reduction look like? How much does it help the pain behind the eyes, the swelling, the inflammation? And then if everything was good, then you can move on to a phase 3 study, where it gets looked at in a much wider patient population. These studies can take many years. It can be performed in hundreds of thousands of patients, and it's really to make sure, is there any, does the preliminary data match what we're seeing? And then after all of that, it gets repackaged again. All the patient information is anonymized, and it gets packaged again to the FDA for their approval. After that, you would think that we're done, but no. It still gets looked at and monitored by the FDA. So currently, Tebezza is in a phase 4 we call post-marketing, where it's commercially available, and it's really to look for, are there any untoward side effects that are still coming out, because we want to make sure, foremost, safety is the most important thing. So to give an idea of what this really takes, approximately 1 in 5,000 compounds, when we have the lock and key, the keys really make it through to the final phase of this, before it becomes commercially available. The process takes 15 years. I think it's taking longer and longer every year because of the complexity of what it really takes. And the cost is staggering, anywhere from $1 to $2.5 billion per product. So what does this look like for Tebezza, right? When Tebezza was first studied in the lab, it was actually looked at for as an oncology medication. It was one of those keys that was tested, and somehow scientists found that it worked really well for orbital tissues and decreasing orbital inflammation. The phase 1 studies, when it was first given to patients, was back in 2006, almost 2 decades ago. And it was finally approved in January of 2020. And interestingly enough, this drug was actually fast-tracked, and it was given what we call an orphan disease status, because this was the first medication in an unmet therapeutic disease area. And so if you think about the timeline of what a fast-track drug looks like, you can see an idea of what we're looking at today, maybe something that's just coming down in the future. Okay, so I get a question a lot. Why are there not more drugs for thyroid eye disease? Why is it just Tebezza? Part of it has to do with how rare the disease is. If you look at the epidemiology, the incidence of TIDES for men is 3 out of 100,000 men. For women, it's 16 out of 100,000 women. To put this into context, the incidence of breast cancer for women is 129 women out of 100,000, right? And if you think about how many patients get diagnosed with high blood pressure or hypertension, it's approximately 1 out of 4 adults in the US. The disease is also very variable in how it presents. Dr. Rao mentioned 40 to 50% of patients with TIDES elevation, right? It's not everyone has the same manifestations, and often the diagnosis is delayed. So this is a quote that I found in one of my papers I was looking at about TED, and it really echoes what a lot of us as providers feel about the disease area as well. There's really an unmet need for good treatment that has good safety and good long-term benefits. Okay, so moving back to thyroid eye disease, we talked about that there's a lot of different targets that are now being looked at, and this is really represented by the diversity of the clinical research and studies that are now available on the market. So this is a really busy table. I'm going to go over it very briefly, but essentially what I've listed is, on the left, the name of the products that are coming out. And you can see some of these only have letters, BRDN001. Drugs aren't given a formal brand name until it's approved by the FDA, so sometimes it's just letters for the name of the compound. I have the name of the pharmaceutical company that produces the medication, the target, and how it's administered. So we know that Tebezza affects the insulin growth factor 1 receptor. It's given as an IV medication, so directly into the vein. There are now medications that are now targeting the IGF-1R pathway, so the same pathway, but given in different formulations. So there's one study that is looking at a pill form that's given twice a day. There's another study that's looking at this same target, but given as a subcutaneous injection. So it's a medication given directly under the skin, similar to insulin or Ozempic. And then there's a lot of other targets being looked at as well. The IgG pathway, the interleukin-17, 6, 11 pathway. I can go on, but don't let me. So at Kahana Osteoplastic Surgery, we're involved in several clinical studies. We've had patients who have completed the studies. We have patients that we're actively enrolling. We're involved with Viridian Therapeutics, Acelerin, Immunovan, Sling, Tourmaline, and Lasting studies. Right? We have 2 full-time clinical trial coordinators who really support us and help us with this. But I will say we are still prescribing a lot of Tebezza as well. What this has allowed us to do is that it has allowed us to become more nuanced and individualized in how we treat patients, right? If we're affecting a different pathway, a different target, the side effect profile is different. And it really allows us to individualize how we treat our patients. And that's what I really love about it. But don't worry, we're keeping Sarah busy with our Tebezza authorization still. Okay. So why do patients participate in clinical trials? If you're thinking about it, or if you're thinking about, if you have a loved one, well, you gain access to new treatments that have been shown to be safe and work well, that are just not commercially available yet to the public, right? Perhaps none of the current standard treatments have worked, or the side effects just don't work for you. Insurance. We know in Michigan that certain insurance companies are just more tricky than others in your prior authorization guidelines. or lastly, you just want to help others and help advance scientific discovery. Okay, so for more information about clinical trials, the NIH has the website, www.clinicaltrials.gov, that gives more in-depth information. And of course, you can always ask one of us as well. And that's it. Thank you.